Thursday. Thank you so much for joining us for this discussion. My name is Josiah Gilliam, and I'm the My Brother's Keeper coordinator in the Mayor's Office of Equity. And we've been doing a series of broadcasts exploring the intersections of that work. And recently, we've been taking a look at the concept of trauma and the folks that serve communities at different levels, the folks that research this topic in different fields, to really uplift work that's happening, to raise awareness, to talk about what's working and about what the future can look like. And we know that any discussion along these lines is timely, but we feel that there's a special opportunity to really lean in, to explore the intersections and to be about work that can save lives. Through the community-based organizations that do this work, through the entities that are active in this space, and through the individuals that dedicate their lives to building peace and to healing. And in the past couple conversations, we've done a couple of like high-level overviews, the kind of a systemic piece looking at work that's been happening in the county, in the state, and in the city related to this work. Then we did a bit of a deeper dive into research and to what we know from a neuroscience perspective and what happens with the brain and things like this. Today's conversation is really special. I'm very excited to get into it because we have a chance to look at trauma and healing and these concepts of community through folks that know what the work on the ground looks like very well. Some of our panelists today have been on conversations in the past, and so I want to start by thanking each of them for their time today. What I'm going to do is start with a round of introductions, and then we're just going to jump, right in. Some of these topics can be challenging. It's my intention as host, and I invite you to do the same if you're watching, to hold space for what's raised. We'll be doing that for each other in the conversation. But we encourage you to do the same for yourself and for just in general in community, especially as we're coming out of COVID, to hold space for the testimony and what folks have gone through, what they're experiencing, so that we can understand where each other is coming from and start there with that sense of community. So without further ado, I'm going to go around. My friend, please introduce yourself as you would like, name, organization, what brings you this conversation. And I'll start with Reverend Cornell Jones.
Appreciate that, Josiah. Excuse me. Appreciate that. It's an honor to be here. I am Reverend Cornell Jones, the Group Violence and Intervention Coordinator for the City of Pittsburgh. Just glad to be here, man. Just have a passion for our communities. And, a lot of that passion came from working in the community for years and working in the prisons and juvenile detention centers and just seeing how important dealing with trauma is. It's extremely important, and I'm glad to be able to be a part of this conversation.
Thank you so much. Taili Thompson.
Hello, I'm Taili Thompson. Definitely humble to be here, to be a part of this conversation. I've been involved with doing this violence prevention work for over 19 years now. I'm currently the Director of Violence Prevention Initiative at Operation Better Block, under the leadership of Jerome Jackson. And just with being in the space of violence prevention in general and understanding the trauma that violence brings in our community, you have to be humble. So I'm humble to be in this space, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Taili. And Dan.
Yeah, thank you, Josiah. I'm really grateful to be a part of this conversation as well. I've known Cornell and Taili for a couple of years, and I deeply admire the work that you both do, and your example is part of why I do the work that I do. You've inspired me, so I'm grateful to be part of this panel. I'm with the Neighborhood Resilience Project as program manager of the Trauma Response Team, which is a gun violence trauma response ministry.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for being here. All right, Taili, I want to start with you, sir. Just set the stage for us. We talked in recent conversations around the public health approach to violence. And really, this is related to this idea of a disease model. So could you just kind of set the stage for us and talk about this work from those perspectives?
Right. So I've been involved with this work for over 19 years. And during that time, I've had the experience of working under Richard Garland with this violence prevention work, but also being able to understand the language of Gary Slutkin from Chicago, who runs, it's Cure Violence now, but it used to be called Cease Fire Chicago. And we basically, the model that I was a part of with Richard Garland was the identical model of what Dr. Slutkin is. And what it is looking at violence as the disease that it is. And when you've been in this space for so many years, you see that it's a disease like any other disease. The language states that your greatest chance of catching tuberculosis is your exposure to it. Your chance of catching the flu is your exposure to it. And now in these COVID days, you understand that your greatest chance of catching COVID is your exposure to COVID. And violence works the same way, is that your greatest chance of being a perpetrator or a victim of violence is your exposure to violence. And therefore we have to treat it similar to the way we treat other contagious diseases. And that involves, four, basic core principles. The first one is the ability to interrupt the transmission of the disease. That's done by individuals known as street outreach workers that have a pulse on the community, understands what's going on in the community, and they may have the ability to actually mediate conflicts that are going on. There may be conflicts happening in the community that the average residents may not know is happening, but outreach workers are knowledgeable, understand, and they have the ability to be able to interrupt that transmission by doing what's known as a conflict mediation. And any time that you interrupt the transmission of the disease, you prevent the disease from spread. The second way is the ability to be able to prevent the spread of the disease. And that's when you cross individuals to the disease, you help them with services, with resources, so they can move forward after they've been in this space of exposure to the disease. The third one is changing community norms that actually promote more violence. In these communities that have high exposure to the disease violence, a lot of times some of our behaviors after the disease pops up ends up promoting more violence. A clear, quick example of that is that if homicide happens on A Street, it happens on A Street, everybody minds their own business, close their curtains, turn inwards, aren't concerned about their neighbors. Then if something happens on B Street, but on B Street, folks come out. They want to find out if their neighbors are okay. They're engaged with what happened, what might have took place. They're engaged with the violence that happened. So what ends up happening is that the people that are responsible for committing the violence in these communities start to say, okay, if we committed on A Street, folks mind their own business. We committed on B Street, folks are in my business. And therefore they'll tend to avoid B Street. So these are different things that actually what are called community norms that might actually promote more violence. Then the other one is the underlining, which is a fourth one called identities. And that's being able to connect youth with identities that are known to outcomes. And those identities end up being a layer of safety within the community. And then giving individuals who may have identities that are known to produce bad outcomes, as an adult, giving them the ability to do what's called identity transformation. So just, as setting the ground on folks understanding this disease. Currently right now, we're, in these underserved communities that we're in addressing this violence, we're actually fighting two diseases right now. We're disproportionately affected by COVID, and we're disproportionately affected by the violence that is actually taking place within our communities. So I'll just kind of, kick that off as just a base layer of folks understanding this disease model and what it is when you look at violence as a disease that it actually is.
Well, thank you so much. So when you're talking about this idea of transforming identities for young people in particular, what are some of the best ways to go about doing that? And what are the more successful approaches with that kind of thing? So
I'm gonna give you some clear examples on how identity transformation worked for me in different stages in my life. There was a time when, I grew up in the era when, gangs kind of first started in the city of Pittsburgh. And during that time, I had an identity that I was known as a student athlete. I played at Perry Traditional Academy. We were on, state championship team, and the community knew me as a student athlete. So when guys that were involved in the violence that was taking place between the two different communities would see me, they knew my identity and said, he's not a part of what we're into right now. He's an athlete. He's a ball player. He doesn't come out of that identity every now and then. You know, he always, like, you'll see him at a basketball court, or he's in school, or he's involved with something with that identity. So what happened was my identity gave me safety. And there's been several examples where folks have came to our community to commit violence, came across me, understood and realized my identity, and left me alone, and then went 2 blocks down the street and actually committed violence with someone that they felt like was more within the identity of what they were involved in with the violence at the time. And then later on down the line, when my identity actually changed and my risk level changed as I became older, and I started making bad decisions for myself and for the safety of my community, when my identity changed, there were leading to things that were harmful for myself, harmful for the community. But when I came across the work that Richard Garland was doing, he gave me an ability to do what was called identity transformation. And when the identity transformation kind of kicked in, it was as simple as, instead of me being, for anybody that's familiar with the North Side, instead of me being on Federal Street by 12 o'clock every day and engaged in that illegal activity that happens on Federal Street, I was literally to the right. If you go to the right of Jacksonia, where I grew up, you'll see Brighton Road. And at the end of Brighton Road, you'll run right into CCAC. And I literally, when I got involved with the work with Richard Garland, violence prevention work, you would always catch me on the campus at CCAC. Even when I didn't have class, I would be at CCAC. So it was just this difference between being on Federal Street and being at CCAC. That gave me an identity transformation. It lowered the risk for myself and the risk of violence that I could cause towards the community as well.
Thank you, Taili. So Reverend Jones, I'd like to go to you, sir. So you've heard Taili's overview. I'm wondering what your reactions, are there, and then can you talk to us about the group violence intervention work, because this is a structural piece within city government. You work with folks in community as well. So could you react to Taili, what's on your heart, and then walk us through what GVI is and does?
Sure, and it's funny, Taili, because now I see why you like to have meetings down at CCAC so much, because of that connection. That's cool stuff. So with that, just reacting to everything that he said, it's, he's 100% right on point with it. And it's amazing to be able to see, that identity piece, One thing I learned is people want to identify with something, which is why it's so important to be able to have strong identities and people like, Taili, and, positive people like yourself and Dan, just that are out there, that are, they're able to show people that you don't have to have the identity that you used to have. You could have a new identity, which really sort of takes me to the one of the parts of group violence intervention, which is probably the heaviest part that we put most of our emphasis on, and that's our outreach teams, our outreach part that we do on a regular basis. Our outreach teams are people who are people of influence, people who are community, I like to say community giants, people who have been known to love on the people as much as possible, the community mothers, the coaches, the clergy, and the people that are just, just hardcore pillars in the community. Those are people that have an identity that a lot of times people want to get that people want to get it connected to. What's amazing is some of those people that have that identity had a different identity in the past, which is why they're able to show that you could change your life. You could be an example. You could be a resource. You don't have to be what, as they say in the prison, what your jacket says you are. And that means what your record says you are and things like that. You could be someone who's been transformed, just like Taili. Taili is an amazing person who on the front lines is being able to show people that you don't have to live that life anymore. You could be a change agent now and be a part of making communities better. But the group violence intervention project or initiative was actually something that was brought to Pittsburgh. Officially, 2017 is when I came in, and that's when the City of Pittsburgh was brought together an outreach team, social services, and selected law enforcement people that were coming together because they saw that, just like David Kennedy, who started this initiative, they saw that you can't do one without the other. Believe it or not, and as much as I love the power of outreach, we outreach needs the law enforcement component, and law enforcement needs the outreach component, and we all need resources. So when you put those things together, you're able to work really hard. And group violence intervention actually reduces homicides and gun violence. It minimizes harm to communities by replacing enforcement and deterrence. And the way that we're doing that is, number one, making sure that we're utilizing the outreach members, the outreach teams, utilizing the community members who are saying, I want to volunteer, I want to be a part of this village to give back, and fostering strong relationships between the community and even law enforcement. What happens is, some of the things that we've been doing are going to big events, and being able to make sure that the first level of that people are dealing with is outreach, is community coming to the table to be able to go there to say, we want to be able to help you to be able to have a good time. We want to make sure that you're safe, but we're going to do everything that we can to do that. We've gone to big events. We've gone to people's houses. We've gone to down to the jails, to the juvenile detention centers, wherever we got to go to send a message of peace. And what's amazing is a lot of people don't realize that sometimes an officer might even be there with us. And when we're doing these things, the officer isn't there telling them that we're going to arrest them. The officer's there with a whole mindset of, we care about you. We want you to be able to be productive, and we want to help you through this process, which is why we bring what I like to call the village together to be able to strengthen the community so that they could be as empowered as possible. I'm a believer of never giving up on anybody, and which is why, in my faith theology, it's what I call the Saul to Paul transformation. It's being able to utilize that person who everybody gave up on, and now help them to be able to get the resources so they could be effective, and now be that person who is able to help transform the communities. And through this initiative, we've been able to change lives. We've been able to help empower people, and we've been able to, it's funny, right before we were on this phone call, right before this Zoom, I received a phone call from a woman who said, I heard about what you're doing, and I want to be a part of it. I want to be a part of the movement. People see that this isn't, it's time to go from sitting on the sidelines and saying, why don't they, to the concept of why don't we? And by pulling these resources from the outreach team, the social services and law enforcement together, we're really able to transform community and make it really happen to a whole nother level. So I've been excited about it. 2017, I came on. This year, dealing with COVID, we've had to change a lot. You know what I mean? Violence prevention has totally changed. You know what I mean? We went from, we were still doing street intervention, but we're also feeding people. We're also making sure that we're dealing with mediations where people from their own family members were about to shoot each other. You know what I mean? Things like that, because there was so much tension and so much hostility because of uncertainty and things like that. So, I mean, it's been amazing. I'm blessed to say that we have an awesome team of people who, from everyone from neighborhood resilience to, Taili being over at Operation Better Block. We're blessed to have, the Reach Initiative, South Pittsburgh Peacemakers, and Mad Dads, and a set of people who are volunteers, the village at large, coming together to say, this isn't something that we're going to let happen. We don't want, in fact, Taili always talks about changing the norms. Like, we don't want young people dying on a regular basis to be our norm. So we're going to do everything we can to make sure that people know that this isn't what we're accepting. And it's cool because we even have law enforcement that are seeing that this is the way. You can't arrest your way out of a situation. In fact, I'm a believer, let's love our way out of a situation so we can be able to help the community heal as much as possible.
I appreciate that so much. I want to stay with that idea of love and this idea of transformation too. You mentioned that you'll sometimes go, to the jail. And I think a lot of people think about your work, Reverend, in terms of preventing violence from happening. But you've told me stories of how when maybe something still does take place, that you're still there with that message of love. Can you talk with us about that approach? Why is it important to maintain those relationships and to reach out to folks, no matter where they are in their Saul to Paul journey, so to speak?
I appreciate that, man. It's so important that even if, a lot of times we'll tell somebody like, listen, man, we want to help you and this and that, you know what I mean? We want to give you the resources for your success. And sometimes they don't follow through with that situation. You know what I mean? And then they end up getting in trouble and they get arrested. But my thing is, we have an idea and a concept of don't give up on that person. Don't give up on that person. So there have been times when we've gone up into the jail or even a detention center and say, hey, you know, I know what you did. You know what I mean? I know what you did. My thing is, how do we help you so that this type of thing never happens again? Because sooner or later, God willing, they're going to be coming back out to the street again. So what do we do different to be able to give them some resources? How do we connect them with the faith community? How do we connect them with, you know, everything from the reentry programs that are going to help give them the resources, you know, 412 reentry, whatever it is, that how do we connect them to these programs to be able to lock arms with them, to be able to say, we will do whatever we need to do to be successful. You know, what's been amazing was through this process, there have been times when I've brought mothers who lost loved ones to the jail with me to be able to meet with that person so that they could actually realize that what they did, you know, it affects not just that person that you shot at or you did that to, but it affects the village at large. But we as the village at large are willing to work with you to be able to give you that support to be able to help make some change. We don't give up on you. We don't give up on you. I think that's like the biggest passion to me is, you know, someone who came from working in the penitentiary for 10 years is like, I see, you know, the results of like, you know, what happens when people give up on people, but I've also seen the results of when you lock arms with that person and you help to bring the genius out of that person too. You know, and then I also realized, you know, I was talking to, you know, a lot of the things that are going on streetwise, you know, just with the whole trauma piece, my mindset always thinks of what's their story, what made them get to this point to be able to do something like this, and realizing that a lot of times that we see the results of this person who is carrying a gun and all that type of stuff, but we don't realize that back, you know, in the past, they went through a lot of traumatic stuff. I like to sort of relate it to that old concept of when you're making a snowball. It might sound funny, but when you're making a snowball, when you were a little kid, you take that snowball and you roll it and it gets big, and it gets huge. People don't realize that way back then, it was a little pebble of a snowball. And that's like the type of trauma and the situations that we deal with on a regular basis. We see the big snowball, the thing that's blocking, you know, the way that as far as we can see, but we don't realize that way back when that person might have been sexually assaulted, way back then when that person might have been, you know, have gone through so much trauma, so many traumatic experiences that helped to transform their life in a way that was negative, and we just see the results of them shooting out and acting out because of the pain and the anger that they're dealing with on a regular basis, which is why I said we can't ever give up on people because they're a part of the village and we got to love them.
It's wonderful. Dan, I'd like to turn to you, sir. Could you talk to us a little bit about the Neighborhood Resilience Project? And then I want to get into this idea of the response to trauma and how you all approach that. But yeah, if you would, just an overview of Neighborhood Resilience Project from your perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So Taili and Cornell have both touched on trauma within the community, and tragically, trauma disproportionately affects communities of color, especially African-American communities. So community trauma is this big, massive social issue. And as Father Paul has taught me, issues don't have solutions, problems do. And so what the Neighborhood Resilience Project has done is taken this social issue and broken it down into individual problems, and then created a program to address that problem, to alleviate the trauma within that problem. So a couple examples of programs that exist within the trauma response team that have arisen over time. We have food insecurity in our communities, right? So if kids are dependent on school lunches and don't have food at home, the Neighborhood Resilience Project and Father Paul have created the backpack feeding program as a way of packing non-perishable food, handing that out to schools on Thursdays and Fridays so kids can take that home and eat that over the weekend, right? And the backpack feeding program, when it was at its peak before the pandemic and the schools started to shut down, we're feeding upwards of 10,000 kids a week, handing out those lunches. The reality is that trauma isolates community members, and I think Cornell and Taili have talked about that. When you experience a threat, when you experience trauma, it affects your sense of trust and safety in the world, and you stop trusting your neighbors. And so you start to feel this social isolation from your neighbors. So we have trauma-informed community development, and we've raised up and trained behavioral health community organizers that help connect community members to address community problems as a group, right? To start to lean on your neighbor for help. And so the behavioral health community organizers go block by block and take communities that have been traumatized, and over time draw them out and get them talking to each other until they start to transform into healthy, healing micro communities, block by block, right? Another program within the Neighborhood Resilience Project, medical insecurity, right? If there's lack of access to medical care, we've created a free health clinic that helps the uninsured and underinsured through doctors that volunteer their time pro bono by appointment. We've seen the pandemic disproportionately affect communities of color. And so we've trained up and have a group of community health deputies that go out door by door and answer questions about the COVID-19 vaccine. There's obviously historical reasons why people would mistrust medical interventions from within the communities of color. So these community health deputies can answer questions about the vaccine, and if people are interested, get them access, get them connected to vaccine clinics. And so the next one is my program, which is the trauma response team. Gun violence does disproportionately affect communities of color. We've learned and seen that gun violence doesn't just affect the families directly affected. Gun violence affects the entire community. And communities that are most affected by gun violence are also, unfortunately and tragically, the most neglected by mental health resources. And so the trauma response team works hard to stand in that gap, to intervene in the immediate aftermath of gun violence and shootings. So we have a team of volunteers that we've trained up, and we deploy on our 31-foot RV. We go out into the neighborhood within 48 hours of a shooting, and we offer compassion and stabilization to the neighborhood. So we are an acute response that helps to stabilize, to make sure people don't feel alone in the immediate aftermath. But two, we also have a referral network of trauma therapists that can help with the chronic trauma, the ongoing trauma, to walk beside people on their journey from trauma towards resilience. And then third, when we're talking to people out in the neighborhood, if we hear some hints of people who are considering retaliatory violence, we work through violence interrupters like Cornell and his team to intervene in a way that leverages community relationships, right? That brings the village around these people who are hurting and wanting to lash out in their pain and trauma, and offer them alternative ways to vent that anger and that trauma. So those are the three ways that we kind of get involved: acute, chronic, and preventative for retaliatory violence.
Thank you so much. So
yeah,
let's walk through a theoretical incident like that you're referencing, that I'd like each of you to kind of weigh in on the pieces at play. So can we talk about, let's say there is an incident, or that there's a situation that might be trending towards violence. Taili, Cornell, how are you all becoming aware of that? And how do you think about intervening in that process?
I mean, I'd say there's a couple of things that we'd have to figure out. So depending on what type of situation it is, if this is if this is after a shooting or a possible shooting, a lot of times what will happen is you get community members, because we're blessed to have people who are of the community, who are pillars in the village. People will tell them what's going on, and one of the steps that we'll do is, because we'll know what's going on, the next thing that we'll do is we'll find out, how do we get to that person? What how do we, and a lot of times who is connected to that person, that's like someone that they look up to, who's the resource, who's he's the OG in their life that they look up to, that we could connect them to. And then depending on the level of what's going on, you know, a lot of times we'll do what's called a custom notification. If we know that this is getting extremely intense, a custom notification is when myself, um, a mother of who lost a loved one, usually outreach worker, a law enforcement person, and a clergy person. Well, we'll go to that person's house, and go there and talk to them and say, hey, you know, we're here. Number one, because we care about you. Word is that you're planning on doing something that's going to jam you up. In fact, you know, I'm a little bit more raw in my approach on that, because I'm like, you know, word is, you know, if we're at your door right now, that means you hot. You know what I mean? That you're doing a lot right now that's gonna jam yourself up. And I don't want to see another genius genius being buried, and I don't want to see another genius in the penitentiary again. So then usually the mother jumps in and, you know, gives a breakdown. You know, Val Dixon's been one who's been amazing with that. Val's letting them know, like, this isn't the life. You don't want this for your family. You don't want this in your life. You know what I mean? Then the clergy person comes in, and then they're pretty much like, you know, we don't want to bury any babies and that type of thing. Then outreach, they're usually, the outreach person that's usually there is usually looked at as someone who was an OG in that community. And OG is looked at as we like to say original gangster, someone who's extremely respected in that community. And they're like, look, you remember how I used to get down? Look at me now. I'm giving back. I changed my life. You see how I'm loving it on the community and all that type of stuff. And then the law enforcement the law enforcement person is usually the one that they think that when we're going there and we're talking to that person and their family, they think that the law enforcement person is going to be last because they're going to arrest them. But law enforcement's like, no, we're not here for anything like that. You know what I mean? You heard what Reverend Jones said. You heard what the people said. We're here because we want to stop an arrest. We want to stop you from doing something that is you know, that will mess with your life. And with that, you know, I'd say 90-some% of the times that we've done that, people have fall back from doing what they were doing. I remember one time when, you know, I usually lead this speech, but I remember one time when a person wasn't hearing me at all. They weren't hearing anything I was saying, and that's why it's important to have key people on your team when you're doing this. But they heard what Val Dixon said, and when she said something, and that person who I believe was going to be a shooter probably that night ended up falling in her arms in crying because there was so much pain and so much trauma. And then we were able to connect those resources and being able to follow up, be able to help them get employment and help them stay out of the way. And I could say until this day, like up to this day, that person's been out of the way. That hasn't got caught up in any major street violence or anything like that. And that's been 3 years. That's huge. Those are huge victories. And that's what happens when the village works. So with that, if there was, and I'm probably going too much, but with that, if there was a homicide, the first thing that I'll do is I'll get the information and I'll contact Neighborhood Resilience. I'll let them know what's going on. They come out, they do their thing, they set up. I also then contact my outreach team to be able to connect with them to find out, you know, what's going on, who's the next one, who's the next person that might retaliate, what resources do we need to do to be able to help stop that situation. Do we need to do the custom notification? Do I need to go to the hospital to talk to the family? Do we need to go to the crime scene to talk to the family? Who's the family? Who are the people that need to get help, and what resources do we need to get help with? If we connect with somebody who needs resources and needs to get some type of support, I then call Taili, my man Taili. Then Ty, you could jump in and talk about what you do, bro.
So we currently, just to kind of back up a little bit on just another, let's say, angle, because we do have an infrastructure in place where outreach workers are filling out risk level assessments every Wednesday. And they come to a dashboard, and with that risk level assessment, outreach workers, you know, may be able to list something as it has a yellow, red, green, you know, green, everything as far as they're concerned, there's no violence, you know, kind of stirring up. Yellow is there's some tension that may potentially lead to violence. And then red, violence has occurred. And there's some steps that need to be done. And actually on the risk level assessment, the outreach workers are able to choose what they feel would be some of the best things to kind of address it, where they may say, we need a custom notification. Then that, you know, we'll notify Cornell. Outreach workers feel like there needs to be a custom on this particular individual. they may feel like there may be need increased street outreach work. And then there's been times when outreach workers felt like, yo, there's tension happening here. And Cornell, you need to get police presence in that area just so that we prevent the disease from happening. Because we've always known in these communities that once it happened, the potential of it spreading is high. So there's been times when outreach workers said, listen, we just need a police presence so that we prevent something from happening. So they don't have to deal with the aftermath of the spread. And so I just wanted folks to understand we do actually have a system in place on how, because the thing is that outreach workers, because of who they are, they have the ability to where they're knowledgeable of some underlining things that may be happening. A lot of times community members may be going about their normal everyday life and they don't understand that there's tensions, that there may be some things that happen. There could have been a particular robbery that happened that they're not aware of, but outreach workers have a pulse on what's happening underneath the surface. And that's truly a blessing. And then it gives us, those individuals, it gives us the ability to be able to, kick some things into place. Because one thing is that when violence is happening in these communities, it's very seldom is it random. Like there was things that are happening led up to these violent incidents occurring. And it's like, and it's just like the disease has already been exposed in a particular area. So I'm gonna give you two quick examples that emphasize this disease that was on the news. One of them was on the news this morning. There was 3 kids from Penn Hills High School killed, right? That wasn't like a random type of thing. It was the disease. So let's say shows where a kid pops up with COVID in Penn Hills. If you don't end up quarantining that kid, coming in with some stuff right away, then you would have other kids exposed, right? So the disease of violence pops up, one kid gets murdered. The next thing you know, within 8 days, 2 other kids from Penn Hills are murdered, right? That's the disease spreading. 2 weeks before that, 3 kids from Perry High School, 2 current Perry High School students and 1 who graduated the year before. The disease pops up, just like COVID pops up. In the same way there's a potential for COVID to spread, next thing you know, 3 kids from Perry is dead. So the thing is once the disease pops up, we need to get in there, you know what I mean, as soon as possible to do what we do when you go to treat a disease. And there needs to be things that are happening prior to that so that you prevent the disease from even popping up and spreading. And those are the things, with COVID, you say, okay, mask, social distance, educate, the whole nine. Violence is the same exact way, because at the end of the day, we're always coming after a trauma has happened, because these are areas that have high exposure to the disease of violence. They've always been traumatized. And that's the importance that you're dealing with it with, I need violence prevention, outreach work, but then I need someone to address the trauma. Because even though, let's say there isn't a homicide in the north side of Pittsburgh and Northview Heights, just as an example, right? Trauma has already happened in that community. So you need folks in there dealing with that trauma, because before the next act of violence happened, it's always after trauma has already happened and they've already been exposed to the disease of violence. So I just wanted to kind of like make that clear. And these are clear examples that people could be, where they're like, okay, I did see on the news where 3 kids from Penn Hills, were killed. And then 2 weeks ago, 2 current students from Perry and 1 from last year were killed. This is not, these aren't like coincidence. These are like COVID's popped up. We're not doing anything, if you don't do things to kind of get in there and prevent the spread, then you could look up and the spread kind of takes off.
Yes, thank you so much. And so Dan, I'm sorry, Cornell, did you have something you wanted to add there, sir?
Yeah, the number one, I just wanted to make sure that we say condolences to the families. You know what I mean? Because that's some heavy stuff, and we're praying, for everybody dealing with that, and we're working together to try and stop this type of stuff from happening. So condolences. But I think it's important to also know that people don't realize that even at a lot of these funerals of situations, like it's the outreach workers that are inside of the funerals and the funeral homes and things like that, making sure that, not all in front of everybody, but making sure that things are peaceful, and making sure that things are peaceful. We're the ones who are working. And this is when we do connect with the police, to make sure that there's a car that's close, you know what I mean? So that, because the family a lot of times will say, hey, we're worried about any type of retaliation. So we'll make sure that there's a car down the street, or I'll make sure there's a car down the street that is, far enough just so that the family feels comfortable to be able to grieve, in a way that they feel safe. You know what I mean? So there's a lot of things that are happening behind the doors, and even working with the schools to be able to make sure that this type of stuff doesn't happen on a regular basis, working with the coaches, working with the community in a lot of different ways. We don't talk about a lot of these things, but it's so important to know that we're trying to get to the point where we're as Taili was talking about, being able to add those protections, the like we do with COVID, the mask and things like that. We're trying to add our protections so that we're able to get people away so they could get the help and the support that they need. One thing I'm learning is that if you're able to get to them, it's a battle between how much do you want to be free from this situation, or do you want to stay in this type of lifestyle. And once the emotions start getting in, it takes people who are specialists in interrupting that disease of violence, which are outreach teams that really know how to deal with that because they lived that life in the past. You know what I mean? So we're blessed to be able to have those type of protections, but we're trying to add to those protections, which is why it's so important for the community to get involved too.
Yes, thank you so much. So Dan, I'd like to turn to you. So let's talk about this same, kind of hypothetical incident. A shooting does take place, a violent incident occurs. What does acute response mean, and how do you all respond?
Yeah, we call it acute because the first 48 hours after a traumatic experience is the acute phase of trauma. And so that's when the doors start to close to trust and safety in the world, right? And so studies have shown that interventions within that first 48 hours help to keep that door open. So the trauma response team has a group of volunteers that are trained. We have an RV. Cornell might notify us of an event, or we might hear about it on the news. And within 48 hours, we are planning to go out to that neighborhood on our RV. And so we notify our volunteers, rally at our office in the Hill District, and they go out to the crime scene. We'll canvass the neighborhood. We'll walk around and interact with people in public spaces, offering that compassion and stabilization. The RV before the pandemic served as kind of a sanctuary, a mobile sanctuary, a safe space where people could come in and talk about their experience without their neighbors seeing. And we're getting back to that now that people are vaccinated. And so we have the RV set up where we can offer hospitality. We have an area in the back we can partition where if there's a parent with kids and the mom or dad wants to talk to one of our team members in the back and talk about their traumatic experience, we can talk to them, partition it, and entertain the kids up front with maybe a PS4 game or some coloring books. And that helps the parent be fully attentive to their conversation with us, knowing that their kids are safe and being well looked after and nearby, right? But we don't knock on doors. We know that trauma has been visited on these communities, and so we don't want to crash into people's lives. We leverage community relationships. So we talk to people on their street, on their porches, and we ask if they know of any neighbors who are going through it, who are really struggling. And if they do, would they please connect us, right? They could call them and invite them out to talk to us while we're around. We give them our contact information and some of our flyers and literature so that they can contact us at a time when they're ready and maybe feel safe enough to do that. And that's when we start the referral process, right? Of if people have been affected by gun violence trauma and are experiencing trauma symptoms, and their sense and trust and safety is starting to close them off from helpers within their community, then that first 48 hours intervention, whether they accept help within those 48 hours or not, it keeps that door open enough that they can start to get the help that they need when they're ready.
You mentioned this idea of studies showing that intervention within 48 hours have been proven effective. What other kind of research-based topics inform your work? And I'm particularly interested in this concept that I've heard in different spaces recently around ACE, and that's an acronym. Could you walk us through what that is and how it informs the work that you do?
Sure, of course. Yeah. So ACE refers to adverse childhood experiences. And so the ACE scores, I think the studies show that at least 2/3 of the general population of the United States has at least one adverse childhood experience out of a questionnaire of 10 potential adverse childhood experiences. 2/3 have one, right? 20% of the general population has, I think, 3 or more. Studies have shown that if you have 5 or 6 ACE experiences, ACE scores, then you are at significantly higher risk for physical, psychological, behavioral, and social problems, ranging from heart disease, diabetes, stroke, on the physical side of things, on the emotional side of things, depression, anxiety, PTSD. From the behavioral, it could be risky sexual behavior, self-medication through substances, uh, difficulty regulating emotions, right? Strong emotional outbursts to triggering situations. And all of these lead to kind of the societal impact of difficulty sustaining opportunities, right? Chronic unemployment, domestic violence. These are social issues, societal issues that come up with people that have a high ACE score. And the studies show a strong correlation between the higher the ACE score, the higher the risk for some of these physical, social, psychological, and behavioral problems. And Father Paul has administered the ACE questionnaire within the Hill District, just informally with people, and he has seen that the average scores within the Hill District are 6 or 7, right? And so we have this concentration of trauma within communities of color that are leading to all these other risk factors. And a big reason why the acute response to things like gun violence, or having the different problems we have, or the different programs we have with feeding kids and a free health clinic, why they exist to try to alleviate the disproportionate impact of trauma on communities of color, specifically among African Americans.
Taili, Cornell, I'm wondering where your hearts and minds go, given that topic. There's this idea of generational trauma, this idea of generational poverty. These are terms that we've heard within communities. Can you ground us in how this shows up in community, where an individual that has these adverse childhood experiences, there may be these impacts. What are the impacts for when that is perpetuated over time, and when communities experience that reality over time? And then we'll pivot to what we might be able to do in healing and things like this. But I'm wondering what your reflections are.
So I'll give you, so what I'm thinking about it, the first thing that's coming to my mind is a couple of things. First, from my experience in being a chaplain in a penitentiary, something that I've seen, a lot of guys, when that door was shut, and a lot of people would break down crying because of the trauma that they've gone through as a kid, you know what I mean? And a lot of those things that happened to them as a child, which equaled them being this angry individual that didn't have any coping skills, that didn't have any resource or any type of support system, and which helped them to end up being in situations that they got caught up in, that ended them up in the penitentiary. You know what I mean? That was something that I always thought was so important. Being one who worked on the victim side and the offender side, I've learned that a lot of times the people who that were the offenders were victims in the past too, in a lot of different situations. We don't see that, but the reason I'm sharing that it is because that's past history of things that have happened in the past. But then I've also been one who worked in the juvenile facilities through the years too. And when I was working with the juvenile in the facilities, one of the things that I would realize is I would be working with some of the people, and people say, "Hey, I heard you work over at the penitentiary." tell my dad I said hi. You know what I mean? You know, and so you got generations of, you know, things that have been going on through so many different years. And I'm like, okay, these are cycles. These are cycles. You know, my wife talks about cycles all the time. These are cycles that need to be broken. These are cycles that of you know, the drug alcohol abuse that people have seen. Why people don't ever say why are they why they, you know, people are like, oh, everyone in my family's an alcoholic. Okay, what's the history of where did it start? Or, you know, what happened? And then you find out that someone was sexually abused back then, or even you know what I mean, back to grandma being abused, you know, back during the civil rights movement and beaten and all that type of stuff, where she started to numb it with drugs and alcohol. And now, you know, years later, we got generations of people that think that it's okay, and the pains of being people disrespecting people and feeling like this is the way that they're supposed to talk to people because of the pains and never getting that healing process. I just feel like that's been important to understand that this stuff goes in cycles, and it goes, and if you don't get the proper help, you know, just to be honest with you, as an outreach worker, as someone who deals in this field, if you don't get the proper help, it could jam you up. It could mess with you, everything from your household to your children to your focus on a regular day basis, because we see so much pain. So it's something that has to be dealt with on a regular basis. So, but I've seen the cycles. I've seen, you know, the grandfather, and I've also seen the father and the son in the same cell. You know what I mean? That it came at a different time. So these cycles are things that have to be broken. So that's just something that's heavy on my heart, and I feel like it's important to know. But these cycles are something that I feel like that are the elephant in the room. The problem is we're acting like it's not there.
Right. So in preparation for this actual conversation, I decided let me grab some snatch from some headlines from something to me that displays the generational cycle and how this disease and how the trauma kind of affects generation after generation. And what I have here, if you can see on the screen, it says a few slave gets 1 year probation, right? So this is from a newspaper in 1965. So October 9th, 1965, as you guys know, from me giving this history, is my grandmother was murdered on the north side by a white woman, and the argument that they seem to call as a feud was that the white family owners felt like my grandmother shouldn't live in their neighborhood on Ridge Avenue because they were homeowners. And there was a guy who owned the building, bought a building, and started renting to Black families, and my grandmother was one of them. So the white homeowners felt like this Black family, I don't know if they thought it would bring down their property value, or if they just felt, threatened by these Black families. And it became this tension, and this tension, kind of went back and forth. The night that my grandmother was murdered, the woman had threw a brick through my grandmother's window, and it almost hit one of the babies that was on the couch. And my grandmother went to confront the woman, and had my uncle, who was 14 at the time, with him. And when she went to go to confront him, it got to the point where the woman's daughter came out. She was 25 at the time, and she shot my grandmother in the head, and she shot her in the chest, and then she shot my aunt in the leg, and she fell over. Only reason she survived because she fell over the porch at the time. And this woman pled guilty and received 1 year probation from the judge. And from that point on, and my grandmother was the only child as well. So and she was a single mother of 4 at the time. And my mother was 11. And if you ever, know my mother, my aunt, and them, they're all survivors. But my grandmother was Taili Thompson. This happened October 9th, 1965. And this is on the north side on Ridge Avenue. And then you fast forward, my brother was the first homicide of January 1997. And when you understand violence and this disease of violence, you see how they're connected. You see how this Black family was infected by the disease of violence. And a lot of times in our communities, over generations, there were situations where white mobs came into Black communities and they committed violence. I mean, folks know about the Tulsa massacres. Things like that happened in America all throughout this country over the years. So it would be like someone who's responsible for, let's say, COVID in the neighborhood. And then after that, they give you no assistance to eliminate the disease of COVID. And then 10 years later, you're dying from COVID in that neighborhood. And the person that brought it says, what's wrong with y'all? Why are y'all still dying from COVID? And it's like, well, you infected me with COVID. So white people have infected Black communities with the disease of violence. And then 10, 20, 30, 40, 60 years later, they're saying, what's wrong with these people? Why are they dying from this disease I infected them with? And we didn't give them the resources to treat it. A lot of times what ends up happening, like even in the community that my brother died in, you know, he was only 2 or 3 blocks from where his grandmother was murdered on Ridge Avenue. Ridge Avenue, literally where Taco Bell sits. And my brother died on Jacksonia Street, which is known as Mexican War Street's first homicide in 1997. So at that time, my brother was a part of gang violence, and he was killed by another gang member. So at that point, it's Black on Black crime. But once you expose folks to the disease of violence, the original carrier of it doesn't have to be around for the disease to continue to spread. And I seen that. So then we had a community that was generationally affected by trauma, generationally affected by the exposure to the disease of violence, to the point that the community was like considered this terrible community. And folks moved. I know after my brother was murdered, my mother just literally left the house and moved with her husband to another place. And then they eventually lost the house to back taxes. And then folks came in and said, yo, there's value in this location. This is where the Mexican War was led from. General Robinson led the Mexican War from this street. There's value in this place. And then now it's to the point that the house I grew up in, I can't even afford to live there anymore because it's a completely different community than when it was affected by that disease of violence that we were in. But even then, my uncle, who was 14 at the time, he was never right ever since. Like, he had this anger, he eventually had to be treated. And then maybe 30 years later, he eventually died in the process of them detoxing the chemicals out of his body. And when he came out of the chemicals, he still had that anger from the 60s when he was 14 years old. And his heart, they said his heart failed at Allegheny General, and he died as well. But there's just signs of so many, things within our family to where it's, at the time, the present time, you'll say, what's wrong with them? Instead of saying what happened to them. Right. And we're not talking about, that generational thing where they say, your ancestors were slaves. We're talking about me, my grandmother, my brother's grandmother. And for folks that understand grandparents, your mother's mother, you have a certain connection because it's mama's babies. It could be daddy's maybe in a sense. But when that baby is born from that mother, one thing that grandmother knows, that's her child. Right. So to never have that connection of a grandmother in the family, and people that understand the value that grandparents bring, you would see that there would end up being problems. And all throughout my first cousins, these are my first cousins, we have different violent, let's say, issues that were like things that drew citywide attention, where it was like, well, why are these people so violent? Like, I got three of my girl cousins really that have a streak of violence in them, but they've been affected with violence before they were even here. When their mother was 12, it happened when my mom was maybe 11, my other aunt was 10, 9, it was 4 of them. So instead of folks asking what happened to them, people always say, what's wrong with them, in a sense. And then when you go through those generations, like, you get to the point of just trying to find ways of coping after you've been infected with that, when you're not treating. So the trauma's never being treated. The disease is continuing to spread, and you just get coping mechanisms, and a lot of times alcohol, a lot of times drugs, even within my families, there's folks that you could identify and be like, okay, I see he ended up, coping for him ended up being drugs. So it's deep. So my thing is, that's why it's important, first of all, with this work, that when you go to address any violent communities of violence, right, that when you have the violence prevention and the outreach work, you also realize they go hand in hand with trauma response and folks that can address the trauma. They have to go hand in hand. That's the one thing. The second thing is that there has to be long-term investments for these things to exist, because as we just realized from COVID, you can have a vaccination and folks decide they don't want to take it. So we're treating the disease of violence in these communities. And just because we put our hands up and say, we have a treatment for this disease, doesn't mean everybody's going to take us on right away. They need to know that we're consistent, that we're invested, that we're here. They need to see it work for other people. And then they may get to the point of saying, man, let's go on down and get involved with some of this treatment of this disease of violence. Maybe we go talk to some folks as far as the trauma. So a lot of times we get caught up where people say, I'm gonna give money for violence prevention, I'm gonna give money for trauma. If I don't see a result in 2 years, then I'm gonna try to see if that money needs to go somewhere else. But that's with treating disease. When I talked with a woman at the health department when I worked over there, she said, Ty, it was 15 years before we started to see a movement on diabetes. But they started on a campaign, and for 15 years, she said, we finally seen a movement on it. So when it comes to us, violence prevention workers, trauma response workers, make the investment, give us time for the community to trust us to be able to treat these diseases and make that long-term investment to where, you know, you'll see, okay, that now the community is trusting this process, these individuals, and now we start to see some progress being made as it pertains to treating this disease of violence in these communities that have been exposed to the disease of violence.
Incredible. Thank you so much. I want to open it up just to the rest of the panel for reactions or just general thoughts. And I want to pick up on this theme that Taili was talking about too, which is this idea of trust building, treating the disease, and healing. Where does that concept begin to come in this conversation? But please, reactions or just thoughts.
You know, I'm a believer that you got to build relationships. You know what I mean? You got to build relationships. That's key. You got to be amongst the people. You know, if people need to, if they need to be able to see for themselves that, you know, that you can't do this, which is, you know, when I talked about the violence prevention interrupters, like those are people who are known or respected, and once they're amongst the people are able to see a change. And, you know, those are the people who could walk them to the place to be able to get the support that they need, which is why they're so important. People don't understand their role is so important. And that's key. Bringing the faith community in the mix is key to me too. But realizing that, you know, there's a stigma in the Black community that, you know, if you go to get some type of therapeutic help, you know what I mean? Like, you know, there's something wrong with you and all that type of stuff. No, you know, it's my wife always shares, you know, if you break your arm, you're going to a doctor. You know what I mean? You're going to the places that you need to go to be able to get the support and the resources to be able to get the help that you need. So these are people who are given God-given gifts, you know what I mean, to be able to help us through this process. So, you know, if there are people that are afraid to go, you know, I've told people I'll walk you to get some therapeutic support. I'll walk you through the process to be able to get you connected to a reentry program that works. I'll walk you to, you know, Taili, and I'll do the handoff to Taili because I trust Taili to be able to get, you know, the resources that they need to be able to get help. I'll drive you up to Neighborhood Resilience, and we'll sit down with Dan and Father Paul and Antoine or whoever we need to sit down with to be able to get them the resource. So it's about relationship. Relationship is key. Relationship is key in letting people know that, you know, this is a process. This you didn't get here overnight. It's not going to be overnight to get it fixed. But, you know, through the village, we could really make some things change.
Just a quick thought, like how much more important is your mind than your arm, right? I mean, so if you're going to go to a doctor to see your arm, why wouldn't you take even better care of your mind and your psychological well-being? Yeah, I think the big reason why the trauma response team is volunteer-based is that we want everyday people helping everyday people, right? Our dream trauma responder is someone from within the community that is disproportionately affected by gun violence, walking beside their neighbor, right? When we go out there, the acute response is important, don't get me wrong, but it does take the village. It does take wraparound relationships and the whole community surrounding people. So the reason we train everyday people, it's not, we don't have this movement of clinicians and clergy, although we do have clinicians and clergy on our volunteer base, but we want to embed trauma awareness and trauma support into the DNA of Pittsburgh and Allegheny County. And the only way you do that is to start to train volunteers. You get people scattered throughout the city and throughout Allegheny County who can be part of our acute response, but could also be part of the chronic healing with their neighbors, right? And the reality is, when we go out and talk to to people who have been traumatized by gun violence, I think Taili touched on this, other traumatic experiences from decades ago start to surface, right? Because these traumatic memories are spot welded together. They're dredged up by the recent trauma of experiencing or witnessing or hearing gun violence, and in a way that has nothing to do with a story or a narrative. They are remembering and sometimes reliving through flashbacks things that happened to them decades ago, because that was also a trauma, and that threat is spot welded in their brain to a threat.
Taili, I wonder if you could touch on where mindfulness comes in for folks' own resilience and healing journey. And then we'll bring this conversation to a close. Obviously, there's so much more we can unpack here. But what does it look like, Ty?
So it's mindfulness, man. It changed my life. I'm gonna be honest. There was a guy, Richard King, Dr. King, who was just persistent. Like, man, he reached out to me and said, listen, I want to do mindfulness in communities that's impacted by violence. And he just was persistent. And then I got to the point, I said, I took him up on it. My organization, Youth Opportunity Development, we had a location on the north side on Rizaka. One of my board members, Reverend Dave, said, let's just start doing classes once a week here on the north side at 10 o'clock. And, Richard came and we started having classes, and there was different guys who came home from jail. I invited them to the class. I eventually, during that time, my brother was shot, and I ended up giving Richard an in into the hospital for him to do mindfulness with my brother. But the thing is that when you do mindfulness, literally, when you have a routine and you stick to it and you're consistent with it, it takes 60 days, I want to say 2 months, and literally the physical makeup in your brain starts to change. Like, it actually changes. And prior to me getting involved with mindfulness with Richard King, is I never could be present at meetings that I was at. So I would be at a meeting and I'd be thinking about where I came from or where I had to go. So I'm always was trying to process my next step. So it didn't allow me to enjoy the present. So I could be in a meeting and I would only be ready to speak whenever it was my time to speak. So I might have prepared what I was going to say wherever I was at before I got there. So my mind constantly raced all the time. But after, studying with Rich, man, and I continued to do it, it allowed me to eventually have peace, man, where I could be at a meeting and I'm present and I'm engaged with what's going on. Like, my mind's not racing. It's not sending me anywhere. And anytime that I attempt to do some form of mindfulness on a regular basis, so that I make sure I stay in tune, because it was one of the most clearing things that happened to me. And these are things that we need in our communities, is that we need mindfulness practices. But we need to understand that they, first we got to trust the people that they work. And I think with some guys, that I grew up with, they know if I'm saying it's working, they're like, all right, I trust Ty. Because, I always, kept it, as 100, as they would say. So I'm not selling you on something, because there's nothing to actual sell. Because with Richard, he didn't want $1. He just wanted to come in and do mindfulness in communities that's been impacted by violence. And then he wanted me to teach me to do it, with other folks, where I've done that before. I've done it with my wife as well. I even started doing some mindfulness with my son and felt like it could give him more concentration with the high level sports that he plays. So all of these things, from trauma response to mindfulness, are changing community norms. Understand, if you've been trained as a trauma response guy and trauma's happening now, instead of you going, remember that community norm I talked about where you go indoors and you close your curtains and you don't concern about your neighbors? if you're trained as a trauma response individual, if the trauma's taking place, you're coming out sad now. You're concerned, is your neighbor okay? You're responding to a trauma that's happened. That's changing a community norm that may have used to lead to violence. Rather than you going indoor, you're coming outdoor. And then as you move forward, you get to the point of being able to do some mindfulness in your neighborhood with some of your neighbors. All of these are changing community norms, and these are things that work. And I've seen them work. I've experienced them, and they changed my life.
It's incredible. All right, let's bring this conversation to a close. One final round of just encouragements for folks, and if people want to get involved and want to learn more, how would they direct them? Dan, I'll start with you, and then go across.
Yeah, I think we might have painted a bleak picture here with ACE scores, but I want to make sure that I say, and I wanted to say earlier, that trauma and adverse childhood experiences are not destiny, right? Healing from trauma, resiliency is possible. As a matter of fact, the attrition rate for trauma therapists is lower than a traditional therapist because they get to participate in seeing someone move from trauma towards resilience in a way that doesn't always happen as quickly with other chronic mental illnesses, right? With bipolar depression or something like that. So I wanted to say that first. I would also say that the trauma response team and the Neighborhood Resilience Project is starting an in-school program this year to raise up trauma-aware supporters from within a student body. It's going to look a little different than going out to neighborhoods, but we're working with schools on that. So, and we're in conversations with schools that are disproportionately affected by gun violence. We are volunteer-based, so if anyone wants to get involved, they can email me at Demerick, DEMERICK @neighborhoodresilience.org. We do have an online application that people can click on, but we welcome volunteers. The main thing that we tell people is all we ask from our volunteers is a baseline level of maturity, mental maturity, emotional maturity, spiritual maturity. The rest we will train you on, and we have a whole curriculum that will equip you to be a trauma responder to your neighbors. So we will train and certify you. All we ask for is maturity and availability. That's it.
Amazing. Reverend Jones.
You know what? Believe it or not, I want people to get involved with neighborhood resilience. I want them to have, 300-400 people lined up, involved with that. I want people to get involved with Mad Dads, organization that's out there in the community, walking in communities. I want them to get involved in GVI and the outreach component of what we do. I think the key is getting involved. You know what I mean? I want people to get involved, and I want people to get healing. You know what I mean? Our people are hurting. People are hurting. Get the support systems that we need. Connect. There's support groups out there. There are people out there. And because there's so much stuff that's going on in addition to COVID, you know what I mean? There's so much that we all need to get support and help for to be able to help, live our life in the best way we can. But don't be afraid to go to that person who's a specialist in that field to get the support. And shout out to Still Smiling. You know what I mean? I'm gonna give him a shout out in the Center for Victims, Julius Boatwright Center for Victims, people like that. Shout out to Dr. Jones, my wife, you know what I mean, who's on the front lines with this type of stuff too. These are, it's important that everybody gets excited to get involved, because it hurts to see people hurting so much, because they're, a lot of times you're not able to keep jobs, you're not able to focus, you're not able to do things, but it's because that situation is going on. People don't realize you got to get the help for that so that you can be successful. And we want to be able to help you get that help and the support so that you could win.
Straight up. Yes, thank you. All right, Taili.
To echo on kind of what Cornell said, I remember years ago when I was talking with somebody and they said, well, there's no silver bullet, hate to use that word bullet, to this. And I'm actually like, there is. The silver bullet is participation. Literally, if we get people to participate at all levels on all things, we'll be okay. Like literally. And and I need people to make the connection that, as they're seeing people react to years of trauma and years of exposure to the disease of violence, that we all play a role and a responsibility in being involved in that. For years, people felt like they could just avoid the communities that are high impacted of violence, and they have no obligation in making sure that those communities are treated for the disease. When you understand this disease, then you realize the generational history of the disease that this country has inflicted on these underserved communities. And that's been a historical response, for this country. I mean, we can't act like on January 6th that we didn't have a mob of white people that murdered police in Washington, D.C. So we've had a history in this country to respond with violence. So for some reason, folks, tend to take a step back and say, why is this happening? Instead of saying, wow, what part, do we play in what's happening over there? So stop asking, people, stop thinking what's wrong with them and say what happened to them and get involved. Silver bullet is participation.
Incredible. I want to thank each of you so much from the bottom of my heart for the work that you do and for sharing this space and sharing so vulnerably. I want to echo as well. I encourage folks to look up Neighborhood Resilience Project, Taili's work at Operation Better Block, Reverend Jones' group violence intervention work, as well as the other organizations that have been mentioned. And to Dan's point, if you've paid attention to this conversation, folks are open-eyed about the challenges, and there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of trauma. There's also a lot of reason to be encouraged. And I think, you have 3 examples here of folks that are dedicating their lives to this as examples of that. There's ever more resources in this space, including paid work. There's ever more trainings in this space to equip folks that want to step forward, to find the right lane for them. There are people ready, willing, and able to connect, and that would welcome that. If you're a faith leader, if you're a community leader, if you're a returned citizen, if you're just a neighbor, there's a place for you in this work, and that participation call that Taili made, I think, is what we want to leave with. It can be tough to take that first step, but just know there are resources available, whether that's trainings, education, et cetera, to make sure that folks are equipped. And Reverend Jones, I'm thinking, about the power of the testimony, to hear the stories from folks in community, how powerful it is to be able to sit with that. And I'm reminded in this moment of this idea of David's mighty men, which are like famous heroes from olden times. But if you look at the origin stories, those are folks that society had given up on. And they were in the desert, in the caves, and that speaks to a barren existence, an oppressive existence, one without a lot of resources, one without a lot of support. And it was those men that ended up becoming these champions that are so famous because there was leadership and there was relationships that did not give up on them, just like you were talking about, Reverend, that walked with them, met them where they were at, and walked with them, and we see the transformation. Anyways. We'll leave it there. Please stay tuned for more broadcasts from the city where we'll lean in to intersection, try to uplift important work, and talk about the challenges and the opportunities. Let's all row together going into this summer. We want peace. We want to build peace. We don't want to just take it for granted or declare it. We want to be about the work of building it, because our communities, our neighborhoods, our families, our children deserve every opportunity to thrive. And we believe that for them. We want to see it become a reality. So without further ado, thank you all so much for your time, and we'll see you next time.